They mocked the plus-sized girl on the auction block as if she were less than human, too heavy, too unwanted, too worthless for any man to spend even a few dollars on. The whole town laughed while she stood there in silence, humiliated under the burning sun, trying not to break in front of people who had already decided she had no value. But then the laughter stopped. A massive mountain man stepped out from the crowd, placed $50 on the table without hesitation, and said in a voice cold enough to silence the square, "She's mine." In that moment, everyone thought they were witnessing a rescue. What they didn't know was that this broken, unwanted girl was about to heal the heart of the only man brave enough to see her worth.
The dust hung thick in the air of Coldwater Creek, a frontier town where hope went to die, and dreams were sold for the price of survival. It was October 1872, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden platform erected in the town square, a stage for human commerce that made even the hardest men look away in shame. Margaret Hale stood on that platform, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to still them. At 19, she had learned to make herself small in all the ways that mattered, even if her body refused to cooperate. The dress she wore, a threadbare gray thing donated by the church, pulled tight across her frame, and she could feel every eye in the crowd cataloging her inadequacies. "Lot 17, the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying the bored tone of a man who'd done this too many times. Margaret Hale, 19 years of age, can cook, clean, and sew. Starting bid at $20. The silence that followed was worse than any insult. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the crowd's heads, a trick she'd learned at the poorhouse. Don't look at them. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you break. "Come now, gentlemen," the auctioneer pressed. "She's young, healthy, and big enough to eat us out of house and home," someone shouted from the back, triggering a wave of cruel laughter. Margaret's cheeks burned, but she didn't move. She'd heard worse, much worse. "I'd need a wagon just to get her home," another voice called out. "More like a cattle cart." The auctioneer's face flushed with irritation. $10. Surely someone— "I wouldn't take her if you paid me $10. A young man in a checkered vest sneered. His companions slapped him on the back, howling with laughter. This was how it always went. Margaret had known, deep in her bones, that this would be the outcome. She was the girl nobody wanted, the burden nobody could bear. Even her own mother had left her at the church steps when she was 6, with a note that read simply, "Too much to feed. God, forgive me." The matron at the poorhouse had been kinder than most, but even she had delivered Margaret to this auction with eyes full of pity. "It's for the best, dear," she'd said. "You need a husband to provide for you. A woman alone, well, it's no kind of life." $5, the auctioneer said, his voice dropping. "Do I hear $5 for this girl?" Margaret felt something inside her begin to crack. $5. She was worth less than a decent horse, less than a month's supply of flour. The town pastor stepped forward, his face grave, and she knew what was coming. He would offer some pittance out of Christian charity, and she would spend the rest of her life as a servant in the church, invisible and unloved. It was then that she felt it, a shift in the air, a ripple of tension moving through the crowd. People were turning, murmuring, stepping aside. A man emerged from the back of the gathering. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox and arms thick as fence posts. His hair and beard were long and unkempt, dark brown shot through with gray, and his clothing, animal skins and homespun wool, marked him as someone from the mountains, someone who didn't belong in civilization. Margaret had heard stories of Elias Crow, everyone had. The mountain man who came to town twice a year for supplies, who spoke only when necessary, who some said had killed a grizzly bear with just a knife. Children whispered that he ate raw meat and howled at the moon. Women clutched their shawls tighter when he passed. He walked with the steady, unhurried gait of a predator, and the crowd parted before him like water. His face was weathered and scarred, impossible to read, but his eyes, pale gray like winter ice, swept across the platform and fixed on Margaret. She wanted to look away. She tried to look away, but something in that gaze held her frozen. Elias Crow stopped at the base of the platform. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with coins. With deliberate slowness, he placed it on the auctioneer's table. The metal clinked loudly in the sudden silence. $50, he said. His voice was deep and rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. She's mine. The auctioneer blinked, recovering from his shock. Sir, the current bid is only $50, Elias repeated, not raising his voice. Take it or don't. I won't repeat myself. No one spoke. No one moved. The man who had made the cattle cart joke took a step back, his bravado evaporating. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Sold then, to Mr. Crow. The marriage will be recorded with the... But Elias was already climbing the platform steps. He moved past the auctioneer without acknowledgement and stopped in front of Margaret. Up close, he was even more imposing, a wall of muscle and scars and barely contained power. She should have been terrified. Instead, strangely, she felt the panic in her chest begin to ease. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then come." He turned and descended the platform, not waiting to see if she followed. Margaret gathered her skirts and hurried after him, keenly aware of the dozens of eyes tracking their movement. Someone wolf whistled. Someone else made a crude comment that was quickly shushed. Elias didn't react to any of it. He walked through the town with the same steady pace, and Margaret struggled to keep up, her breath coming short. He led her to a wagon hitched with two sturdy horses, mountain horses, she noted, built for steep terrain and harsh weather. Without a word, he lifted her into the seat as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Then he climbed up beside her, took the reins, and urged the horses forward. They rode in silence out of Coldwater Creek, leaving behind the pointing fingers and whispered judgments. Margaret kept her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing. What had just happened? Why had he bid so much? What did he expect from her? The questions burned on her tongue, but fear kept them locked away. Instead, she watched the landscape change as they climbed into the foothills, the scrubby plains giving way to pine forests and rocky slopes. The air grew cooler and thinner, scented with evergreen and snow. It was nearly dusk when they reached his cabin. It was larger than she'd expected, a solid log structure nestled in a clearing with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Nearby stood a barn and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting he'd banked a fire before leaving that morning. Elias brought the wagon to a halt and jumped down. He came around to her side and offered his hand. Margaret hesitated, then took it. His palm was rough with calluses, but his grip was careful, controlled. "This is home," he said simply, releasing her hand once she was steady on the ground. "Your room is inside, on the left. I'll sleep in the barn." Margaret's head snapped up. "The barn? But you need privacy," he said, cutting her off. His expression remained neutral, unreadable. "I won't touch you unless you ask. That's the arrangement." "Arrangement?" The word came out smaller than she intended. Elias looked away toward the darkening mountains. "You needed a home. I needed—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I needed to do something right, that's all." Before she could respond, he was already moving toward the cabin, carrying her small bundle of belongings that the church had provided. Margaret followed slowly, trying to process what he'd said. He'd spent $50, a fortune, just to give her shelter? It made no sense. Men didn't do things like that without expecting something in return. The inside of the cabin was spartanly furnished but clean. A stone fireplace with a cooking pot hanging on a hook, a rough-hewn table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and 2 doors leading to separate rooms. Elias placed her bundle on the table and gestured to the left door. "That's yours. There's a bed, a chest for your things, and a window facing east. The latch works from the inside." He paused, then added quietly, "You can lock it if you want." Margaret's throat tightened. She'd expected many things, cruelty, demands, perhaps even violence, but not this careful distance, this almost painful courtesy. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you buy me?" Elias stood very still for a long moment, his back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Because I know what it's like to be looked at like you're worth nothing, and I couldn't let them do that to you." Then he turned and walked out of the cabin, closing the door softly behind him. Through the window, Margaret watched him cross the yard to the barn, his shoulders hunched against the evening chill. She stood alone in the silent cabin, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the lingering echo of his words, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she allowed herself to cry, not from shame or fear, but from a strange, fragile hope she didn't dare name. The first weeks passed in a careful dance of avoidance and routine. Elias left before dawn most mornings, checking his trap lines or hunting in the high country. Margaret kept the cabin clean, mended his spare clothes, and taught herself to cook over the fire, using the supplies in his well-stocked pantry. They spoke rarely, and only about practical matters. More wood by the door. "Stew's on the hook. Storm coming tomorrow." Yet Margaret began to notice small things that contradicted Elias's rough exterior. He always left the best cuts of meat on the cutting board for her meals, taking the tougher portions for himself. When she struggled with the heavy water buckets, he installed a pulley system by the well without comment. He carved her a new spoon when he noticed the old one had cracked, leaving it on the table as if it had appeared by magic. Most telling of all, he never crowded her. If she was in the main room, he stayed outside. If he needed something from the cabin while she was there, he would knock first, even though it was his own home. It was as if he was trying to make himself smaller, less threatening, despite his considerable size. Margaret found herself watching him when he didn't know she was looking. She saw the way his hands, so large and scarred, moved with surprising gentleness when he worked with wood or prepared animal skins. She noticed how he always checked the horizon before dark, as if expecting something or someone who never came. And she heard, sometimes late at night, the sound of his voice from the barn, speaking words she couldn't make out, as if he were talking to ghosts. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Margaret decided to make something special. She'd found dried apples and honey in the pantry and remembered a recipe from the poorhouse, a simple sweet cake that the other girls had loved. It was her way of saying thank you, though she hadn't found the words yet. When Elias came in from his work, he stopped in the doorway, his nose lifting. "What's that smell?" "Apple cake," Margaret said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I thought, well, there were apples, and She trailed off as he approached the table slowly, staring at the modest cake as if it were a holy relic. He reached out, then pulled his hand back. "My wife used to make this," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear. "Sarah, it was her favorite thing to bake." Margaret's breath caught. He'd never mentioned a wife. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I shouldn't have—" "No." Elias's voice was rough with emotion he clearly fought to contain. It's good to remember the good things." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "Thank you, Miss Maggie." He'd started calling her that in the second week. Miss Maggie, always formal, always respectful. But now, in this moment, it sounded different, warmer somehow. They ate the cake together that night, sitting at the table in companionable silence. It was the first meal they'd truly shared, and though neither of them said it, something had changed. After that, the distance between them began to close in imperceptible increments. Elias started coming inside earlier in the evenings. Margaret stopped retreating to her room the moment he appeared. They began to talk, short conversations at first about the weather or the livestock, but gradually expanding to other topics. Margaret learned that Elias had come west as a young man, working as a trapper and guide. He'd met Sarah at a trading post, and she'd followed him into the mountains despite everyone's warnings. They'd had 5 years together before the fever came, 5 years, and a daughter who died in her mother's arms, too young even for a proper name. "I couldn't save them," Elias said one night, staring into the fire. "I knew these mountains, knew how to survive anything, but I couldn't save them. After that, I didn't see the point of going on, except I did. I kept breathing, kept living, and I hated myself for it." Margaret's chest ached with understanding. "I used to pray to disappear," she admitted softly. "When I was at the poorhouse, I'd lie awake and imagine just fading away. Like smoke. Then no one would have to look at me anymore. No one would have to pretend I wasn't there." Elias turned to her, his gray eyes fierce. "You're not nothing. Don't ever think that." "Then why did my mother leave me? Why did everyone at that auction laugh?" The words burst out before she could stop them, raw and painful. "I know what I am. I know how people see me." "They see wrong," Elias said flatly. He stood abruptly, moved to the shelf, and pulled down a small leather-bound book. He opened it carefully, revealing a pressed flower between the pages. "Sarah used to say that the world is full of blind fools who only see the surface of things. She said the most beautiful things are hidden, and you have to be patient and quiet to find them." He looked at Margaret, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart stutter. "You make this cabin feel like a home again," he continued quietly. "You hum while you work. You leave flowers on the table even though I never asked for them. You mended my coat, the one I thought was past saving, and I didn't even notice until I put it on and realized it didn't scratch anymore. Those things matter, Miss Maggie. They matter more than you know." Margaret couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like this, as if she had value, as if her existence was something other than a burden. "I'm afraid," she whispered finally. "I'm afraid that if I let myself believe you, if I let myself hope, it'll hurt worse when you realize I'm not worth the trouble." Elias set the book down and took a step toward her, then stopped himself. "I'm afraid too," he admitted. "I'm afraid that I'll fail you the way I failed them, that I'll wake up one morning and you'll be gone, and it'll be my fault somehow. That's why I keep my distance, Miss Maggie, not because I want to, but because I can't bear the thought of causing you harm." They stood there in the firelight, two broken people trying to articulate the impossible, that they were beginning to heal each other without even meaning to. "I don't want you to keep your distance," Margaret said, the words barely audible. "I'm tired of being alone." Elias's expression softened. "So am I." He didn't cross the space between them that night. But he didn't leave for the barn either. Instead, he sat in his chair by the field, and she sat in hers, and they stayed that way until the embers burned low, simply existing in the same space, no longer afraid of the silence. November brought the first serious snow, and with it, a shift in the rhythm of their lives. Elias couldn't go as far into the mountains, so he spent more time around the cabin, repairing tools and preparing for the long winter ahead. Margaret found herself looking forward to his presence, to the sound of his axe splitting wood, or his low voice as he talked to the horses. She'd also begun to notice other things, small gestures that spoke louder than words. The way he always made sure the cabin was warm before she woke. How he'd started leaving little gifts on the table, a smooth river stone, a perfectly preserved pine cone, a feather from a mountain bluebird. Once she found a small carved figure of a deer no bigger than her thumb, worked with incredible detail. "Did you make this?" she asked that evening, holding it up to the lamplight. Elias glanced at it, then away, his neck flushing slightly. "My hands need something to do in the evenings, keeps them steady." And Margaret ran her finger over the tiny carved antlers. "It's beautiful. Keep it if you want." She did want to keep it. She wanted to keep everything, these small moments, these quiet kindnesses, the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, as if she were something precious, as if she mattered. The realization hit her one morning while she was making bread. She was in love with Elias Crow, deeply, impossibly in love with the mountain man who'd bought her at auction and asked for nothing in return except the chance to give her a home. The thought terrified her. What if he didn't feel the same? What if his kindness was nothing more than obligation, or worse, pity? She couldn't bear the thought of him knowing how she felt and watching his expression close off with discomfort or gentle rejection. So she said nothing. She kept her feelings locked away and continued the careful dance of domesticity, all while her heart grew heavier with things unsaid. Elias, for his part, seemed to be fighting his own battles. Margaret noticed the way he clenched his fists when she laughed at something he said, as if the sound caused him physical pain. She saw how he turned away when she smiled at him, his jaw tight. And once, when she'd stumbled on the icy porch and he'd caught her, the look in his eyes had been pure anguish before he'd set her carefully on her feet and fled to the barn without a word. They were both suffering, both longing, and neither brave enough to bridge the final distance. The breaking point came on a bitterly cold evening in early December. Elias had gone out to check on a section of fence that had been damaged in the last storm, promising to be back before dark. But dusk fell, then full darkness, and he still hadn't returned. Margaret tried not to worry. He knew these mountains better than anyone. He'd probably just been delayed. But as the hours stretched on and the temperature continued to drop, fear began to gnaw at her. By the time midnight approached, she couldn't stand it anymore. She bundled herself in every warm thing she could find, lit a lantern, and headed out into the darkness. The snow was falling heavily now, thick flakes that obscured her vision and made the world beyond her lantern's glow disappear into white nothingness. Margaret pushed forward, following the direction she'd seen Elias go, calling his name into the storm. The cold bit through her layers within minutes, but she kept going. She had to find him. The thought of him out here, hurt or lost, was unbearable. He'd saved her when no one else would. He'd given her a home, kindness, a reason to wake up each morning. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't. Time became meaningless. Margaret's feet went numb, then her hands, then her face. The lantern wavered in her grip. She should turn back. She knew she should turn back. But the thought of returning to that warm cabin alone, of wading through the dark hours not knowing, drove her forward. She didn't see the ravine until she was tumbling into it. The world tilted, the lantern flew from her hand and extinguished, and then she was rolling down through snow and rock and brush, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. When she finally came to rest at the bottom, wedged against a fallen log, she couldn't move. Pain radiated from her left leg. The cold was overwhelming now, seeping into her bones. Above her, the walls of the ravine rose steeply, impossible to climb even if she could stand. She tried to call for help, but her voice was weak, swallowed by the storm. This was it, then. This was how it would end, not in a poorhouse or on an auction block, but here in the mountains, having at least known what it felt like to be cared for, to matter to someone. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the cold pull her down. She didn't know how much time passed before she heard it, a voice, rough and desperate, calling her name. "Maggie, Maggie." She tried to respond, but only managed a weak sound. It was enough. Moments later, Elias appeared at the top of the ravine, a torch in his hand, his eyes wild. When he saw her crumpled at the bottom, the sound he made was barely human, a roar of fear and fury. "Hold on, I'm coming." He descended the ravine with terrifying speed, half climbing, half sliding, heedless of his own safety. When he reached her, he dropped to his knees, his hands moving over her with frantic urgency, checking for injuries. "What were you thinking?" His voice cracked. "Coming out in this storm, you could have died. You almost—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "You didn't come back," Margaret whispered through chattering teeth. I thought something happened to you." Elias stared at her, his face stark with emotion. "So you came looking for me? In the dark? In this weather?" He made a choked sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You foolish, brave, beautiful woman." He stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Margaret wanted to protest, tell him she was too heavy, but the words wouldn't come. She was so cold, so tired. "Stay with me," Elias commanded, starting the difficult climb back up the ravine. "You stay with me, Maggie. That's an order." She really tried, but the darkness kept pulling at her, and Elias's voice seemed to come from farther and farther away. When she opened her eyes again, she was in the cabin, in her bed, buried under what felt like every blanket Elias owned. The fire roared in the hearth, filling the room with blessed warmth. Her leg throbbed, sprained, not broken, thank God, and her hands and feet burned with the pain of returning circus shock. Elias sat in a chair beside her bed, his head in his hands. He still wore his snow-covered clothing, as if he'd refused to leave her side even long enough to change. His shoulders shook. "Elias," Margaret's voice was rough. His head snapped up, and she saw tear tracks on his weathered face. In 2 strides, he was at her bedside, gripping her hand with a desperation that should have hurt, but instead felt like an anchor. "Don't you ever," his voice broke, "don't you ever do that again. I can't lose someone else. I won't survive it, Maggie. I won't." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was so scared that you—" "I was delayed because a tree fell across the path. A tree, Maggie. And you nearly died because of it, because I was too much of a coward to tell you—" He stopped himself, his jaw clenching. "Tell me what?" Elias looked at her, and in his eyes she saw everything she'd been too afraid to hope for, longing, fear, and a love so profound it took her breath away. "That you're the reason I come home now," he said hoarsely. "That I wake up every morning glad to be alive because you're here. That I spend half my day thinking of things that might make you smile, and the other half trying to convince myself I don't deserve to feel this way. That I'm too old, too broken, too stained with death to offer you anything but—" "Stop!" Margaret interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "Stop saying those things. They're true. They're not." She gripped his hand with both of hers, holding tight. "You're the first person who ever made me feel like I was worth something, like I was more than just this body everyone hates. You looked at me, Elias, really looked at me, and you didn't turn away." "How could I turn away?" Elias said roughly. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You survived things that would have broken most people, and you still have kindness in you, still have hope. You humble me, Maggie, every damn day." "I love you," she whispered, finally speaking the truth that had been growing in her heart. "I love you, and I don't care if that's foolish or if you don't feel the same. I needed you to know. In case I died out there tonight, I needed you to know." Elias made a sound low in his throat. Then, moving with exquisite care, he leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. His beard was rough against her skin, and he smelled of snow and pine and smoke. "I love you," he said, each word deliberate and weighted with truth. "I've loved you since the day you made that apple cake and looked at me like I was someone worth thanking. Maybe before that, maybe from the moment you stood on that platform and refused to cry even when they mocked you. I love you, Maggie Hale, and I'll spend every day for the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift." When he kissed her, it was gentle and reverent, as if she were something infinitely precious. Margaret kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and love into that single moment of connection. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his hand against her cheek. "Marry me," he said. "Not because I bought you or because you owe me anything. Marry me because I love you and you love me, and because we deserve to be happy. Please, Maggie, let me spend my life making you happy." "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." He kissed her again, and this time, when he pulled her into his arms, she knew she was finally, truly home. They were married in the spring, when the mountains burst into bloom and the snow melted into rushing streams. The ceremony was simple, just them and a traveling minister who happened through the area. Elias carved her a ring from mountain ash wood, smooth and warm against her skin. In return, she gave him a scarf she'd knitted during the long winter, every stitch a prayer of gratitude. There was no grand celebration, no crowd of well-wishers. But as they stood together before the cabin they'd made into a home, speaking vows of love and fidelity, Margaret felt a peace she'd never thought possible. The people of Coldwater Creek heard about the marriage, of course. Small towns thrived on gossip. Some said Elias Crow had gone mad, marrying that woman. Others whispered that she must have bewitched him somehow. A very few, saw the couple when they came to town for supplies and recognized something that made them turn away in shame, remembering the auction and their own cruel laughter. Elias and Maggie didn't care. They'd found something more valuable than public approval. They'd found each other. Life in the mountains was hard, but it was theirs. Maggie learned to tan hides and smoke meat, to read weather patterns and identify edible plants. Elias taught her to shoot and how to move quietly through the forest. In turn, she taught him that it was safe to laugh again, that joy didn't betray the memory of those he'd lost. They spoke often of Sarah and the baby, keeping their memory alive with stories and small rituals. Maggie never felt threatened by this. Instead, she understood that loving Elias meant honoring all of him, including his grief and his past. 2 years after their wedding, on a crisp autumn morning, Maggie woke with a familiar wave of nausea. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but had been afraid to hope. Now, feeling the changes in her body, she could no longer deny it. When she told Elias that evening, he went very still. For a long moment he didn't speak, and she felt a flicker of fear. Then he dropped to his knees beside her chair, pressing his face against her stomach. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice muffled. "I'm terrified." "I know," Maggie said softly, running her fingers through his hair. "So am I. But I'm also—" He looked up at her, and she saw tears glistening in his eyes. "I'm so grateful, Maggie, for you, for this, for the chance to do it right this time. We'll do it together," she promised. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The pregnancy was difficult. Maggie's body struggled with the demands, and there were moments of genuine danger, but Elias never left her side. And when the midwife they'd brought from the nearest settlement shook her head doubtfully, he'd simply held Maggie's hand and told her to keep fighting. She did. For him, for their child, for the life they'd built together, she fought. On a snowy night in March, their son was born, a squalling, healthy baby boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn spirit. They named him Opul, after Elias's father. and Crow, the name Elias had chosen when he'd left his old life behind. Samuel Crow came into the world surrounded by love, and he would never know what it felt like to be unwanted. Maggie held her son, exhausted and elated, while Elias sat beside her on the bed, his large hand gentle on the baby's tiny head. His face was wet with tears he didn't try to hide. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me everything." "We gave it to each other," Maggie corrected softly. And it was true. Two broken souls, each convinced they had nothing to offer, had somehow created something whole and beautiful, a family, a home, a future. 5 years later, on a summer afternoon, Maggie stood on the porch of their cabin and watched her husband and son in the yard. Samuel was chasing chickens with the single-minded determination of a 4-year-old, his laughter ringing through the clearing. Elias followed behind, his movement slower now but still strong, calling out warnings about the rooster. Maggie's hand rested on her swollen belly. Another child would join them come autumn, a sister for Samuel. This pregnancy had been easier, as if her body had learned what to do, and she felt confident in a way she hadn't before. The cabin had grown over the years. Elias had added a room for Samuel and started work on another for the new baby. The barn was larger, housing more livestock. They'd even acquired a few sheep, and Maggie had learned to spin and weave wool. They weren't rich by any measure, but they were comfortable, secure, and surrounded by the fruits of their own labor. Sometimes people still came up the mountain trail, trappers, hunters, the occasional lost soul seeking refuge. Maggie and Elias turned no one away, offering meals and shelter without judgment. More than once, Maggie had recognized the look in a stranger's eyes, that hollow desperation of someone who believed they had no worth. To those people especially, she offered kindness, remembering the girl she'd once been. A few times over the years, they'd made the journey to Coldwater Creek. The town had grown, and many of the faces had changed, but there were still those who remembered the auction, who'd seen Maggie stand on that platform while men mocked her. Some looked ashamed when they saw her now, healthy, happy, clearly beloved. Others simply looked confused, as if they couldn't reconcile the woman before them with the girl they'd scorned. Maggie didn't waste energy on bitterness. She'd learned that the best revenge was a life well lived, and she and Elias had built exactly that. "Mama," Samuel's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Papa says I can help with the new fence tomorrow. Real helping, not baby helping." Maggie smiled and descended the porch steps, moving carefully. "Real helping, is it? That's quite an honor." "I'm getting big," Samuel announced proudly. "Papa says I'm strong like a bear cub." "That you are," Elias agreed, ruffling his son's hair. He looked up at Maggie, and the love in his eyes still made her breath catch, even after all these years. "How are you feeling?" "Good," she said honestly. "Tired, but good." Samuel ran off to investigate a butterfly, and Elias moved to Maggie's side, his hand finding hers. They stood together in the golden afternoon light, watching their son play. "Do you ever think about that day?" Maggie asked quietly. "The auction?" Elias considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if I hadn't gone to town that day, if I'd let fear keep me away." He squeezed her hand. "It terrifies me, Maggie, the thought that we might never have found each other." "But we did," she said. "Against all odds, we found each other." "We did," he agreed. Then he turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I need you to know something. I need you to understand that you saved me, Maggie, not the other way around. I was barely alive when I bought you that day, just going through the motions, waiting to die. But you gave me a reason to live again. You brought light back into my world. Maggie's eyes filled with the tears. We saved each other, she said firmly. That's the truth of it. We saved each other. Elias pulled her into a gentle embrace, careful of her belly, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Then I suppose we're both lucky. Samuel came running back, demanding attention, and the moment passed into the comfortable chaos of family life. But later, after their son was asleep, and they lay together in their bed, Maggie thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the frightened girl who'd stood on a platform, convinced she was worthless, the girl who'd prayed to disappear because existing hurt too much. And she thought about the woman she'd become, a wife, a mother, a homemaker who'd carved out a life in the wilderness and found it beautiful. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There were still days when old insecurities whispered their poison, when she looked in the mirror and saw only the flaws society had taught her to hate. But those days came less frequently now, pushed back by the steady drumbeat of Elias's love and her own hard-won self-worth. I'm proud of us, she whispered into the darkness. Elias's arm tightened around her. So am I, my love. So am I. Outside, the mountain night sang with the sounds of wind and wildlife. Inside, a family slept, safe, warm, and whole. 3 people who had once been lost and broken, now found and healing. The world that had mocked and scorned them continued to turn indifferent to their happiness. But that indifference no longer mattered. They had built something that transcended public opinion or social judgment. They had built love, genuine and true, from the raw materials of pain and desperation. Years later, when Samuel was grown with children of his own, he would tell them stories of his parents, of his father, the mountain man who'd been strong enough to be gentle, of his mother, the woman who'd taught him that worth wasn't measured in pounds or dollars, but in courage, kindness, and the capacity to love. He would tell them that his father once saved his mother at an auction, but that his mother had saved his father right back, and that together they'd created a legacy of love that would ripple forward through generations. But on this night, Samuel was still young, dreaming innocent dreams in his sholed, and his parents lay together in the darkness, 2 souls who'd found their home in each other, grateful beyond words for the twisted path that had led them here. The story could have ended differently. So easily, it could have ended in tragedy or despair. But sometimes, against all odds, broken things find each other and become whole. Sometimes love grows in the unlikeliest soil. Sometimes the people the world has given up on save each other. This was one of those times, and it was enough.